Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the winding streets of Ottoman Istanbul, where the air smells like roasted spices, sandalwood smoke, and something rich, bitter, and quietly addictive. You wander past crooked wooden buildings with overhanging balconies, your sandals thudding against uneven stones. And there it is again, that smell. You don't know it yet, but that's coffee. Not Starbucks coffee, not pour-over coffee. Ottoman coffee. Thick, sludgy, dark as nightfall, and about to completely rewire an empire. But don't get too excited. The coffee doesn't hit for a few minutes. And honestly, you probably won't survive this era's bathroom situation anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking along the edge of a bustling bazaar in the 16th century, and something about the rhythm of it all feels both chaotic and carefully choreographed. Traders shout over each other while balancing bundles of silk. Lemons the size of your fist are piled high in pyramids, and somewhere near the edge of the leather district, a man is calmly setting up a small stall with nothing but two brass pots and a mysterious little brazier. It's the smell that gets people first. Bitter, smoky, almost burnt. But in a good way, like toast that went exactly 1 second too far. That's how coffee first introduced itself to Ottoman taste buds, through wafts of char and magic. Historians mostly agree that the beans came from Yemen, carried in rough burlap sacks over camel routes that stretched like spidery veins through the Arabian Peninsula. Yemeni Sufis had already been sipping coffee for a while, using it to stay awake during long hours of chanting and devotional poetry. But now it's Istanbul's turn. At first, coffee was a novelty, a scholarly beverage. Something consumed slowly in quiet circles, often with pages of ancient books spread open nearby. It wasn't even sweetened. Imagine drinking your espresso black, no milk, no sugar, no biscotti, just hot darkness in a tiny cup, served with a side of slightly pretentious conversation. But then something strange happened. The bitter brew caught on. Fast. You start noticing little booths springing up beside the barbershops. Men start carrying sezvis, those long-handled pots with the belly of a pregnant cat, hanging from their belts. And more importantly, they start roasting coffee in public, over tiny coal stoves, with absolute flair. One mainstream historical fact most folks skip is this. The first official coffee house in Istanbul opened in 1555, thanks to two Syrians named Hakem and Shams. They set up shop in the district of Tahtakale and basically turned the city's drinking habits upside down. Until that point, it was all about sherbet, those sweet fruit drinks. Or, if you were bold, fermented grain things that made you loud and deeply unpopular with the muezzin. But coffee? Coffee gave you energy without scandal, or so it seemed. The early days of coffee in the Ottoman world weren't just about taste. They were about image. Sipping coffee became a kind of soft power move. You weren't gulping anything. You weren't guzzling. You were sitting, talking, pausing, maybe reading a little calligraphy on the side. Coffee was reflective, philosophical, and, of course, political. But more on that later. Right now, you're following a man with a tray balanced on his hand like a ballet dancer. On it, 4 tiny cups of Turkish coffee, though no one's calling it that yet. Just kave. Each one the color of molasses and the temperature of lava. No handles. Just delicate tulip-shaped ceramic vessels nestled inside metal zarfs. Like silver finger thimbles designed for nobility with excellent wrist strength. Fringe fact, early coffee cups in the empire didn't even have bases. People would wrap their hands around them like fragile treasures or slip them into little felt holders, almost like drinkable nesting dolls. Which makes modern cup holders feel wildly over-engineered, if we're being honest. You crouch by the edge of a fountain and sip your first cup. It's thick, muddy, not filtered. The grounds settle at the bottom like black sand in an hourglass, and it hits your tongue like a secret being whispered at full volume. Behind you, a group of men are arguing, gently, politely, about poetry. Something about how Rumi would have written his ghazals differently if he'd had caffeine. One of them slaps his friend on the back and says something about how bitter drinks build character. Another's just trying to fish a cardamom pod out of his cup with zero success. This moment, right here, this is where coffee begins to stretch beyond the bizarre. It's no longer a passing fancy or a religious tool. It's about to become a ritual, a daily rhythm, and eventually, a problem. Historians still argue whether the speed of coffee's spread was due to its addictive properties, its novelty, or simply the way it made people feel smarter while sitting absolutely still. But within a few years of that first coffeehouse opening, you couldn't walk 50 paces in the capital without spotting a sesve or smelling roasted grounds in the air. Of course, as with anything popular, not everyone was thrilled. Religious leaders whispered that coffee stirred up more than conversation. It made people question things. Stay up too late. Gossip too freely. Some even claimed it encouraged secret gatherings and intellectual rebellion. Two things sultans didn't love as much as, say, docile tax-paying. But for now, you're still safe in the world of first sips. Your hands are warm, your breath smells faintly roasted, and someone's offering you a piece of dried fig to chase the bitterness. You lean back against a sun-warmed pillar, your cup empty, and realize this isn't just a drink. It's an entire empire learning how to stay awake. You stay leaning against that pillar a little too long. The sun's shifting now, stretching longer fingers through the dust and steam of the bazaar. Somewhere, someone sings the call to prayer, and yet no one moves. Not because they've lost faith, but because they're still waiting for their second round of coffee. That's when it hits you. This isn't just a trend, it's a social structure, one that comes with rules, customs, rituals, and an unspoken competition to out-relax your neighbors. You stand and follow the steady parade of men toward what looks like an unmarked house, except there's laughter drifting out the windows and an unmistakable puff of smoke curling upward from the eaves. It's not tobacco, not incense. It's coffee smoke. Roasting, hissing, bubbling like it has something to say. Inside is your first proper Ottoman kavahan, a coffee house. Now, you're expecting something like a modern cafe, right? Baristas, chalkboard menus, maybe a nervous poetry student hunched over their laptop? Forget all that. This place is dark, cozy, almost too cozy. The walls are lined with faded carpets that might have been stolen from a mosque, or generously borrowed, and the ceiling is so low you could touch it with your eyelashes if you stretched. There are no chairs, just divans, cushions, maybe the occasional carved stool that's somehow simultaneously too short and too wobbly. You find a spot in the corner, press your back to the wall, and try not to breathe in too dramatically. The aroma in here is potent enough to knock out a moose. Across the room, a man in a turban is playing a saz, like a kind of lute that sounds like a daydream set to strings. Another is reciting poetry so slowly, you're not sure if it's verse or if he's just forgotten what comes next. And in the middle of it all, the coffee master. He stands behind a long wooden platform with rows of sand-filled pans, slow roasting heaven. The sesves are buried just enough in the hot sand to keep the brew at a consistent near boil, and he moves them with all the grace of a snake charmer. Coffee here isn't just poured, it's conjured. You watch the pour happen, slow, almost ceremonial. The goal is foam, not the whipped kind, not your oat milk latte fluff. This is dense caramel-colored crema achieved through patience, not pressure. The master pours into tiny cups without a drop spilled. No filters, no strainers, grounds and all. You'll be drinking the earthiest parts of the bean, and liking it, apparently. As you sip, you start noticing the layout of the kavahain. It's not accidental. The divans are arranged to encourage listening, eye contact, debate. You overhear three men arguing about the finer points of astronomy. One swears the earth rotates, another insists that's heresy. The third just wants someone to refill his cup. Mainstream fact? These Ottoman coffee houses weren't just hangouts, they were informal universities. Literate or not, if you showed up regularly, you'd get an education by osmosis. Politics, history, poetry, science. One 17th century observer said that coffee houses were like schools of the wise, except with more caffeine and fewer exams. You're halfway through your cup when a curious ritual begins. A man sets down his coffee, clears his throat, and begins telling a story. A long, winding tale about a vizier, a talking bird, and a mysterious glass of poison. No one interrupts. No one yawns. In fact, everyone leans in. This is the realm of the meta, Ottoman storytellers. Trained in memory, voice modulation, and just the right amount of theatrical eyebrow wiggling, they held court in coffee houses like this one, spinning epic tales from Persian legends, religious fables, or entirely made-up nonsense that still somehow felt profound. The fringe tidbit here? Some metas used props, sticks, turbans, even fake mustaches, to switch characters mid-story. If you ever wondered where improv theater got its legs, this might be a good candidate. The coffee house, you realize, is more than a caffeine stop. It's a living room for the entire city. Except no one has to clean up, and that's where the problems begin. Historians still argue whether these early coffee houses were truly subversive or just unfortunate victims of their own popularity. But make no mistake, the authorities noticed. The Sultan's officials began suspecting that too much coffee led to too many opinions, that when people sat together for hours, sipping and talking and laughing, they might forget to stay obedient. So what did the state do? Well, they banned coffee. Sort of, multiple times. The first official ban came under Sultan Murad IV in the 1630s. The logic? Coffee was intoxicating. Not chemically, though let's be honest, drink 5 cups and try sleeping, but spiritually. It disrupted the moral order, encouraged sloth, led to backtalk. Murad was so serious about it, he supposedly patrolled the streets in disguise, catching coffee drinkers mid-sip and issuing, let's call them aggressive wrist slaps. You're sitting here clutching your cup like a relic and praying he doesn't show up tonight. But even in the shadow of a ban, the Coffeehouses lived on. Secret ones, hidden ones, with back entrances and lookouts. Coffee drinking turned into something mildly rebellious. And who doesn't love a little espresso-flavored defiance? One night, you hear about a coffee house with no name, located in a dried-out bathhouse where the beans are roasted over cinnamon bark and the drinks are served with pomegranate seeds. You go, obviously. You sit cross-legged, trade jokes, and sip slowly while someone plays a flute that sounds like a bird on the verge of remembering a song. The coffee isn't just about the flavor, it's about the moment, the stillness, the hush that settles between sips, and the growing sense that this empire runs not just on armies and taxes, but on caffeinated conversation. Your cup's empty again. The meta's tail is winding down. Someone nearby is sketching calligraphy in the condensation on their saucer. You lean your head back and listen to the room breathe, soft, steady, rhythmic. The fire crackles, the sand shifts, and someone whispers, "Another round?" Of course, always. You say yes to that second round, naturally. Not because you're parched, though, let's face it, your mouth does feel like it's been sandpapered by centuries of philosophy, but because something about the way the cup is handed to you, with a nod and that conspiratorial glimmer, makes it feel less like a drink and more like a secret handshake. This time the coffee arrives with something else. A small flat plate holding 2 sticky orbs that shimmer like gemstones dipped in syrup. Turkish delight. Locum if you're trying to impress someone. It's rose-flavored, and it punches your taste buds in the face with floral swagger. Not everyone's a fan, but you're on board. It's like chewing on an edible love letter. You glance around and realize coffee doesn't travel solo in this world. It arrives with ceremony, with accoutrements, with ritual. And sometimes, brace yourself, it comes with fortune telling. Yes, the moment you tip your cup, swirling the grounds and flip it onto the saucer to cool, you've opened the door to foul. The art of reading coffee grounds. Is it legitimate? Who knows? Is it fun? Absolutely. Some people swear by it, saying the sediment left behind can reveal everything from your next journey to whether your cat secretly resents you. The grounds settle. A woman in the corner eyes your cup, then waves you over. She's wrapped in a silk scarf that sparkles faintly under the lantern light, and her smile suggests she already knows you're skeptical. She lifts the cup slowly, studies the trails left behind, like a cartographer reading the map of your soul, and says, "You'll travel far, but you'll always return." You want to ask, return where? But you don't, because deep down, you kind of like not knowing. Mainstream fact time. Foul reading became so deeply ingrained in Ottoman culture that even the elite dabbled in it. Imperial women were especially fond of it. Part amusement, part social bonding, part pseudo-therapy session with added caffeine. And yes, scholars still argue whether this practice originated within the Ottoman world or was adapted from older Persian or Arab customs. The lines blur as they often do in this empire of layered identities. But it's not all mysticism and syrupy sweets. With each visit to a kavehane, you start noticing something else, the hierarchy. Coffee might bring people together, but not all cups are poured equally. There's the obvious divide. The elite have private coffee salons with silk cushions, live music, and servants trained to know the exact temperature a sip should be. You're not there. Yet. Instead, your crowd is artisans, scribes, board students, retired janissaries, and the occasional out-of-work astrologer who insists Mercury is always in retrograde. Still, even in this humbler setting, rank exists. The oldest man in the room gets the first cup, the loudest storyteller earns a refill without asking. The guy who brought fresh beans from Yemen, he's holding court like a sultan. Which brings us to the quirky tidbit. In some regions of the empire, it wasn't just people who held status, but the beans themselves. Yemeni beans, especially from Mocha, were considered the absolute gold standard. Traders would risk their lives shipping them overland to Constantinople, where they were roasted with almost religious reverence. And speaking of reverence, let's talk tools. The chesve, that long-handled coffee pot, isn't just utilitarian. It's a symbol. Its shape, material, and even the angle of the pour are all scrutinized. Brass or copper with a wooden handle that never quite stays cool to the touch. A proper chesve pour is done from just high enough to create a light froth, but not so high as to splash. Because heaven forbid you stain the divan. As you sip, you spot a newcomer entering the kavahoyan. He's young, nervous, gripping a scroll so tightly the edges are crumpling. He bows slightly to the room, as if unsure he belongs. And then, without a word, he unrolls the parchment and begins reading a poem aloud. His voice quivers at first, but by the third stanza he's found his rhythm. The room hushes. Even the fire seems to burn more quietly. It's not an accident. This is a culture where oratory matters, where words are prized like jewels and a good poem can earn you weeks of free coffee if delivered just right. Your mind wanders. Maybe it's the caffeine, maybe it's the verse, but you start imagining the same scene unfolding centuries ago. Somewhere across the empire, in Sarajevo, in Damascus, in Cairo, always with the same warmth, the same silence before applause, the same realization that somehow coffee has become a thread, binding this sprawling, messy, glorious empire together. And yes, that includes the imperial court. Because at the top Kapi Palace, where the sultans reigned behind thick walls and stricter protocols, coffee was no less essential. But the presentation? A little different. There, coffee wasn't just a beverage. It was a statement. served by a designated kvetsi, the chief coffee maker. No, seriously, that was his job. And it was a big one. This guy oversaw everything from bean storage to the precise timing of a service during royal audiences. Historians still debate whether the kvetsi also acted as a kind of informal intelligence officer, listening, observing, reporting back. But hey, if you're the one controlling the caffeine supply, people will talk to you. You blink and realize your cup is empty again. The poetry's over. The fortune teller's moved on. A different man is now arguing with the lute player about whether dates are better roasted or raw. You quietly vote roasted, but only in your head. Someone offers you another locum. You accept. Another hour passes like smoke, and then it happens. A drum beat. Soft at first, then growing louder. From outside. You exchange glances with the others. Stand. Step toward the window. There in the moonlight, a parade of coffee porters marches by. Each carries a tray stacked with cups, steaming and fragrant, heading toward the city's upper quarters. The Sultan's evening round, perhaps? Or maybe just a particularly luxurious wedding. You don't follow, not tonight. Tonight, this humble kavahain is enough. Besides, the fortune teller said you'd travel far, but you'd return. You linger a little longer as the march of coffee bearers fades into the cobbled distance. The scent of cardamom still dances in your nostrils, faint but persistent, like a melody that refuses to end on the tonic. You're tempted to leave, but your seat feels too warm and your curiosity too caffeinated, and so you stay. Good choice. Because now comes the deeper current of this story. The part that flows not in the steaming cups or poetic verses, but in the tension. Political, social, sometimes downright steamy. Because let's be real, any beverage that demands this much ritual eventually provokes reaction. And in the Ottoman Empire, coffee didn't just cause late-night debates, it sparked outright bans. That's right. The stuff that's now fueling your mid-afternoon spreadsheet panic attacks once got outlawed for being too social. Here's the mainstream fact. Sultan Murad IV, not exactly known for his breezy disposition, banned coffee in the 17th century. Along with tobacco, alcohol, and, just for fun, sitting in taverns looking suspicious. His reasoning? Coffee houses had become hotspots for seditious chatter, satirical poetry, and possibly the occasional mildly treasonous limerick. And let's not underestimate the optics. Picture a bunch of commoners gathering nightly to sip bitter brew, swap news, and criticize policy. Using metaphor, of course, because everyone knew better than to call the Grand Vizier a donkey outright. The vibe was more coded roast than Twitter thread, but still. Power doesn't like murmurs in dark corners. Historians still argue whether Murad's bans were truly about moral reform or just a cover for squashing dissent. Either way, his coffee crackdown became infamous. Patrols reportedly roamed the streets, sniffing out roasted beans and smashing sazves with dramatic flair. Legend says Murad even executed repeat offenders. Though let's face it, he wasn't exactly handing out demerits in general. But here's the quirky tidbit. Despite the bans, the empire's caffeine addiction only deepened. People brewed in secret, built hidden compartments in walls, even trained parrots to warn when patrols approached. No, seriously, at least one account suggests a Kavehane had a bird that chirped Yavaş geliyor whenever guards were near. Now that's what you call a feathered barista. You shift in your seat, the cushion just starting to form to the shape of your night. Your neighbor, a portly man with a laugh like a kettle's wheeze, leans over and mutters, "They tried banning laughter too once." You chuckle, then realize he's not joking. Sort of. In certain periods, too much public mirth was frowned upon, especially when accompanied by coffee and political snark. But people kept gathering anyway, because caffeine plus conversation equals irresistible formula. The Ottomans weren't just inventing coffee culture, they were weaponizing it. Soft power, of course, a kind that trickled into every corner of society. The coffee house was no longer just where you got your fix. It was where you heard the news, where you negotiated deals, where a shoemaker might sit beside a scholar and debate the ethics of overcharging for sandals. And that blend of voices, that was new. In most public spaces of the time, bazaars, mosques, hammams, people generally kept to their role. But the Kavehane blurred those lines. You could be a nobody with an opinion and still be heard, assuming your coffee round didn't come with grounds floating like fish. Over time, authorities eased up. Too much backlash, too little enforcement, and honestly, even sultans got sleepy. Coffee bans were quietly repealed or ignored. A balance returned, and with it, a renaissance of ritual. Back in the palace, coffee service had blossomed into a full-on performance art. For high-ranking guests, the Kaveh Saibash's presentation was layered and slow. A servant would appear bearing a silver tray with porcelain cups. Another followed with a tasseled cloth. A third sprinkled rosewater into the air, not for cleanliness, but for scent. A kind of olfactory amuse-bouche. Then came the coffee, always piping hot, always with perfect foam. No milk, of course. And never, ever stirred. You'd think royalty would chug and move on. Nope. This was sacred time. A pause in politics. An oasis in protocol. In fact, some sultans reportedly scheduled entire diplomatic talks around coffee. First the sip, then the strategy. Because no one wants to negotiate terms of war before their daily roast. Back in the commoner's kavehane, you watch as someone pulls out a nargle, a long hookah pipe. It's not technically part of the coffee ritual, but it shows up more often than not. The hiss of tobacco mixing with thick, bitter steam creates a kind of hypnotic fog. Your eyes water, but your senses heighten. Someone strums a lute. Another recites a fragment of Rumi. The coffee keeps coming, and you begin to understand something subtle. This isn't just about the drink. It's about creating space, a buffer from the ordinary, a ritualized excuse to be human together, with all the oddity, insight, and complaint that implies. It's how the empire talks to itself, and the empire listens. Because while most things eventually become corrupted, diluted, or commercialized, coffee in the Ottoman world remains something astonishing. A democratic act disguised as daily habit. Even as European travelers visited and brought the coffee craze westward, launching Paris cafes and Viennese houses of debate, the Ottomans preserved something deeper. More sensory, more secret. It's almost 1 a.m. now, or it would be, if time mattered in this haze. You're not sure how many cups you've had. Your heart isn't racing exactly, but it is humming, like a cat stuck in a vibrating chair. And the man across from you is saying something strange. Each bean, he says, is a story. A memory pressed tight inside. Only boiling water lets it speak. You try to respond, but your mouth is too full of warm foam and questions, so you just nod and let the story steep. You blink, and the lamps seem dimmer, their golden halos wavering like dreams you almost remember. Somewhere behind you, a tray clinks softly. The Kavechi Beisha has returned, and now he's joined by a young boy carrying a brass bowl of sugared dates. You accept one without thinking, the sweetness flooding your tongue as the bitter tail of your coffee recedes. It's a balance game. Bitter, sweet, bitter again, like empire itself. Your eyes drift toward the ceiling, its wooden beams darkened with centuries of smoke and whispers. You try to imagine the first time this space filled with voices. Before the paintings, before the ashtrays, before the chipped cups with their delicate blue vines. Who decided coffee deserved its own temple? Tonight, you're ready to meet the architects, not of buildings, but of culture. The men who took a muddy Yemeni brew and sculpted it into etiquette. Welcome to the world of Ottoman coffee rituals. Yes, the actual rituals, because drinking coffee in the Ottoman court wasn't just a refreshment, it was a performance. A silent theater of hierarchy, timing, precision, and velvet robes that probably made terrible napkins. But beautiful statements. Let's ground ourselves with a fact. By the 16th century, coffee had become so embedded in palace life that an entire staff existed solely to manage it. The Bashu, or chief coffee maker, held a rank just under that of the Sultan's personal food taster. Not too shabby for someone whose main task was boiling water and not spilling foam. But of course, it wasn't just boiling water. When a guest arrived, be they dignitary, poet, or cousin from the provinces, the Bashu sprang into action. His robes were embroidered, his manners impeccable, and his tools? Each one polished to a sheen. Long-handled sesvies, fine porcelain finkins, ornate trays, and cloths embroidered with gold thread. The beans were pre-roasted in a secret blend. Some say with clove, some say with ambergris. Others insist it was just very good storage. Historians still argue whether the palace's signature taste came from the beans themselves or the elaborate preparation methods. The act began with silence. The Basha would enter the room, eyes lowered, and present the coffee with both hands. A gesture of humility, not servitude. One servant held the cup, another the tray, a third might waft incense into the air. And the recipient? They would accept the cup with a slow reverence, sometimes whispering thanks, sometimes simply bowing slightly with their eyes. And here's the quirky bit. It wasn't just about how you served the coffee, it was about when. For example, the Sultan never received coffee until after the afternoon prayer, and never more than 2 cups in one sitting. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe just someone who knew his caffeine limits. But even outside the palace, these rituals trickled down into daily life. In weddings, the bride-to-be might prepare coffee for her future in-laws. But here's the twist. She'd sometimes salt the groom's cup instead of sweetening it. Why? A test. If he drank it without flinching, he was polite. If he choked or complained, well, perhaps he wasn't husband material after all. You sip your own cup now, wondering whether it would pass muster. Probably not. There's a faint graininess at the bottom like silt left behind by a gentle river. You swirl it once and it makes a little whirlpool, just for fun. In Ottoman homes, especially among the elite, coffee was often brought out after meals. A woman might serve her husband or a guest with a level of care that turned every movement into choreography. There were rules about posture, about gaze, about not sipping before your guest, about which side of the tray to present the cup on, and if you messed it up, you probably didn't get thrown in the Bosphorus, but you definitely got talked about. Meanwhile, the tools of the ritual became status symbols. Your cup holder, called a zarf, could be made of copper, silver, or even mother of pearl. And if you really wanted to flex, a zarf made entirely of gold filigree. Of course, the more precious the holder, the worse it probably conducted heat. So yes, wealthy fingers may have been beautifully burned. You glance down at your current cup. It's ceramic, maybe mass-produced with a slightly uneven lip. But it feels good in your hand. Solid. Trusted. And you realize something. Even without the palace trappings, there's still a whisper of ritual in every sip. The pause, the warmth, the tiny act of patience. It was this patience that made the ritual sacred. Because brewing Turkish coffee the traditional way, over a slow fire without stirring, meant you had to be present. Watching, adjusting. Waiting for the right moment when the foam rises but doesn't spill over. Like knowing when to speak or when to stay quiet. The Basha knew this better than anyone. Some were even promoted to vizier-level positions. Not because of their coffee, but because the job required discretion, tact, and a knack for reading people. You don't get that from barista school, and here's something a bit surprising. Women had their own coffee spaces, too. Inside the harem, women of the palace conducted their own gatherings, complete with ornate utensils and their own rituals. Gossip, poetry, music, and yes, coffee, flowed freely behind those famously closed doors. Some even say the women's coffee ceremonies were more elaborate than the men's, though historians still argue whether that's exaggerated by European travelers craving exotic tales. You imagine it now, silken robes brushing marble floors, laughter muffled by brocade cushions, and the gentle clink of porcelain. Outside, a call to prayer echoes distantly. You barely register it at first, just another part of the city's nighttime rhythm. But then a cool breeze slides in through a crack in the wooden shutters, and it brings you back. Back to the table. Back to the warm bowl of dates. Back to the swirling patterns of your half-empty cup. One of the elders across the room raises his voice slightly. You know, he says, they used to say a well-made coffee was the measure of a man's soul. You smile into your sleeve. A little dramatic, sure, but not entirely wrong. Because what you're learning is this. Coffee, in the Ottoman world, wasn't fast. It wasn't transactional, it was texture, time, temperature. 100 choices folded into one tiny cup. And when you handed someone that cup, you were handing them more than caffeine. You were handing them trust. The scent of cardamom hangs in the air now, soft, almost shy, as if it knows it's only an accessory to the real star. Your fingers brush the rim of your cup again, feeling for the faintest heat. It's cooler now, no longer drinkable, but somehow still comforting. A ghost of hospitality still lingering. Like everything else in this empire, the aftertaste lasts. You shift slightly and your eyes land on the brass tray again, this time noticing something you'd missed before. A small velvet pouch resting beside the sesvi. The pouch is open just enough to reveal dark brown grains, glossy and perfectly oval. Coffee beans, yes, but not just any beans. These are from Yemen, or Ethiopia, or maybe even Mocha. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman court had consistent suppliers or if the bean trade was more of a rich man's roulette wheel. But wherever they came from, once those beans arrived, they were treated less like groceries and more like treasure. They were stored in carved wooden chests, often lined with tin or silver to preserve aroma. Some were even perfumed with rose petals, not because anyone wanted floral coffee, but because the Ottomans saw scent as part of the experience. Taste, smell, sound, these weren't separate senses. They were layers of one moment. You lean into that idea as another servant moves past you, his step soft on the carpet. He's heading toward a doorway you hadn't noticed. Narrow, curtained, discreet. Beyond it, you glimpse a different sort of space. Quieter, darker, almost reverent. You rise and follow. Inside, the walls are lined with shelves, wooden, arched, and dusted with time. This is the kahvahan within the palace grounds, not the public kind where merchants and mystics argue over dice and poetry. This one is private, reserved for advisors, scribes, the occasional trusted friend. It's a quieter room, and yet somehow more alive. You pause just inside the threshold and your eyes adjust. On the far side, a man sits cross-legged on a cushion, gently grinding beans with a mortar and pestle. He does it slowly, rhythmically, not because he has to, but because he knows the coffee will taste better if ground by hand. Modern science might disagree, but here, muscle memory is king. And the smell, oh, the smell. Roasted beans crushed into dust release a perfume that is almost ancient, like something your bones remember even if your brain does not. The grinder nods at you, a quiet greeting. No words necessary. You nod back, trying not to look too much like a 21st century imposter in Ottoman slippers. You make your way to a corner cushion and sink down. It's softer than expected. A tray is brought again. Different cup, same care. And as the coffee pours, you find yourself wondering, how did this drink, this bitter, muddy concoction, become a core of empire? Part of the answer lies in a word you may not expect. Diplomacy. Because coffee wasn't just served to guests, it was gifted. The Ottomans, clever as ever, realized that sending bags of exotic beans to foreign courts did two things. First, it impressed the socks off European monarchs who were still sipping ale for breakfast. And second, it subtly reinforced Ottoman power. We drink this every day, the gift implied. And now you can too. Thanks to us. Quirky tidbit here. Some Venetian ambassadors reportedly smuggled coffee beans out of Istanbul by hiding them in their clothing. Not exactly Ocean's 11, but still. Imagine being frisked for contraband espresso. But the diplomatic use of coffee didn't stop at bean deliveries. Within the empire, sultans used coffee to smooth over political tension. Inviting a rival to coffee was a calculated move. It said, "We're not at war, not yet. Have a cup while we discuss your future." And if no coffee was offered, that spoke volumes too. These rules weren't written down, of course, they were understood, inherited, like the correct angle for a bow or the best time to release a falcon. And here's where the lines get blurry. Was the ritual invented by the elite and passed down? Or did it rise from the streets and filter upward into gold leaf chambers? Historians still argue whether coffee etiquette was top-down or bottom-up. Personally, you suspect it was both. Empires tend to copy from whoever makes things look cool. You glance around the room again. Someone's playing a stringed instrument quietly. Maybe a timbre, maybe something else with a name you'd forget before your second espresso. The sound slips through the air like steam from a hot cup. You close your eyes for a moment, and when you open them, another story is forming. This time, about those public coffeehouses. Because while the palace had its own rituals, the streets of Istanbul had their own revolution brewing. Quite literally. By the 17th century, kahvehaneler, public coffeehouses, had popped up in every district worth mentioning. Think Starbucks. If Starbucks also offered political debate, shadow puppetry, and the occasional arrest. These coffeehouses were loud, vibrant, borderline chaotic. Men from every class gathered to talk, argue, scheme, recite poems, or just watch the world stumble by. And always, always there was coffee. Thick, strong. Served without sugar but with plenty of opinion. This is where culture simmered. A young poet might debut his verses between cups. A traveler might share wild tales of far-off lands. A rebel might whisper discontent from behind his steam. Coffee wasn't just fuel. It was permission to talk, to think, to linger. No surprise then that the state got nervous. Several times across the 16th and 17th centuries, Ottoman sultans issued decrees banning coffee. Too stimulating, they said. Too rebellious. Too likely to make men forget their place and dream bigger than their rank allowed. And yes, quirky fringe alert. One sultan ordered all coffeehouses shut down and had coffee drinkers flogged in public. Another reportedly had repeat offenders sewn into leather bags and tossed into the Bosphorus. A bit extreme for a latte, no? Still, these bans rarely lasted. People loved their coffee too much, and besides, even officials like to sip from time to time. You can't outlaw something that's already soaked into the cushions of your society. You shift again, the cushion under you giving a little puff of dust and history. Someone offers you another refill. You hesitate, then nod. It's late, yes, but time feels elastic here, stretched and softened by caffeine and candlelight. The new cup warms your hand, you bring it close and inhale. Earthy, smoky, layered, like all the things this empire tried to be. And so you drink again, feeling the story deepen. The sip is slightly cooler this time, but no less powerful. It rolls across your tongue like silk soaked in soil and fire. You've tasted this bitterness before, maybe in a modern cafe with a name ending in bucks. But there, it was sanitized. Here, it's alive. Here, it carries secrets. The shadowed corners of the palace begin to hum. You notice now how the coffee experience reaches beyond taste. It's performance, it's art, it's strategy. You're not just drinking it, you're participating in a centuries-old act of cultural theater. You lean back, letting your spine melt into the cushion, and think about the people who kept this world spinning. Not the sultans or viziers, but the unsung coffee artisans. The kahveci. Yes, the coffee masters. They were more than glorified baristas. In the Ottoman palace, the Kaveci Usta, the head coffee brewer, was a trusted courtier. Not just anyone could prepare the Sultan's coffee. That would be like letting your intern do your tax returns. The Kavesi had to be skilled, discreet, and loyal. One wrong spice or one overheard conversation could mean exile or worse. Being too frothy wasn't the issue, being too informed was. And there were plenty of secrets to hear, especially during the long hours of waiting while the Sultan met with foreign envoys or plotted the next campaign. You start to wonder how many political turning points happened over a silent cup. Probably more than historians will ever know. Some scholars debate whether the Kavesi held real influence or were just decorative servants. But stories float through time about Kavesis who acted as informal advisors, confidants, even spies. The coffee cup, after all, was always within earshot. You bring yours to your lips again, appreciating how something so simple, ground beans and hot water, could wield this much gravity. Speaking of gravity, there's a peculiar little branch of the coffee tree worth exploring. Fortune telling, yes? Ottoman-style tasseography, the art of reading coffee grounds. You smirk slightly, already picturing crystal balls and incense, but this practice wasn't all superstition. It was ritual. Conversation starter. An excuse to stay longer and look deeper. After finishing a cup, the drinker would tip it over onto the saucer, let it cool, and hand it to the reader, often a kavetsi or trusted female attendant. The patterns left behind became maps. A crescent moon might mean good fortune. A swirling line? Travel? A strange blob that looked like your cousin Hassan? Bad news. And sure, this wasn't exactly science, but it wasn't supposed to be. It was a way to connect, to soothe nerves, to giggle and wonder aloud. Some sultanas reportedly relied heavily on their favorite fortune tellers, using coffee readings as much as astrology or political advice. Quirky, yes. But in a world where omens shaped everything from marriages to military campaigns, coffee grounds weren't that far-fetched. You swirl your own cup idly, imagining what message might appear. Hopefully not another blob cousin. The air around you shifts slightly, and now you're back on your feet, wandering a new wing of the palace. This one smells different. Less like spices, more like parchment and candle wax. You've entered the scriptorium. Here, scholars and scribes record everything. Royal decrees, philosophical musings, shopping lists, yes, even those. And today someone is writing about coffee. You peek over a shoulder, very politely of course, and see the delicate calligraphy of a manuscript. It's a treatise on the health effects of coffee. Did you know Ottoman physicians once debated whether coffee dried the body or invigorated it? Some swore by its warming properties, while others worried it caused melancholy. Historians still argue whether early Ottoman medicine embraced coffee as healing or merely tolerated it as popular. What's more amusing is how medical opinions changed depending on who was in charge. When coffee was in favor politically, it was praised as a digestive aid. When banned, suddenly it was a dangerous stimulant that overheated the spleen. Modern science might roll its eyes, but you can't help but enjoy the theatrics. It's like blaming your bad mood on Mercury retrograde, but with more robes and tassels. Still, these writings weren't just hot takes. They were part of a larger, methodical attempt to understand this drink's effect on the body and soul. Coffee, in its own dark, bitter way, helped shape early scientific inquiry in the empire. People studied its preparation, its aroma, its effects, sometimes for knowledge, sometimes for excuses. You take another sip. Now you're curious about the women behind the curtain. Because while the public coffee houses were famously male-dominated, the harem had its own caffeinated rituals. And if you thought the Sultan's kavesi was important, wait until you meet the kahveci basha of the harem. This woman, usually chosen for her skill and discretion, prepared coffee for the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and other high-ranking women. Her role required more than a good brew. She needed grace, patience, and the intuition to know when a cup needed extra cardamom or when a pause in service was a silent message. At the harem's coffee ceremonies were quieter but no less complex. Served in tiny gilded cups, often with embroidered napkins and rosewater on the side, the act of coffee was one of delicate diplomacy. A raised eyebrow could mean more than a political speech. A delayed refill? A subtle punishment. Of course, historians still argue whether the harem's rituals were truly about coffee or whether the drink was just a socially accepted excuse for women to exercise their own soft power. Either way, those tiny sips carried weight. You imagine yourself there now, navigating the subtle art of sugar placement and cup holding etiquette. It's like a royal chess game, but one that stains your teeth and keeps you up all night. Your own cup is nearly empty again. You hold it gently, feeling the faint warmth still nestled in the porcelain. You could stop here, but you don't. Not yet. Instead, you tilt it ever so slightly and watch the dark remnants slide across the base. Maybe it'll form a shape, a sign, or maybe, like the Ottomans knew too well, the real meaning lies not in the bottom of the cup, but in the hands that offered it. You glance up. Someone's approaching, a tray, a nod, a fresh cup. It seems your night in the Empire isn't over yet. The cup is placed before you without a word, but with the precise choreography of someone who's done this dance hundreds of times. The tray is silver, the saucer rimmed with gold leaf, and the coffee itself, well, it smells like the beginning of a poem and the end of an argument. You take it, nodding politely, and as you lift the delicate vessel, the room shifts again. You're no longer in the palace, but out on the streets of old Istanbul, the pre-dawn haze turning the cobblestone silver. This is where the pulse of Ottoman coffee culture truly thrums. The kahvehane, the coffee house. You step through a narrow wooden door and immediately enter a cloud of smoke, chatter, and steam. The kahvehane is packed. Men recline on low cushions. Games of backgammon click and clack in the corners. And above it all, the aroma of roasting beans drifting like a lullaby for the politically charged and the sleepless. But make no mistake, this isn't your hipster co-working cafe with oat milk options. The Ottoman kahvehane was part salon, part speakeasy, part debate stage. One moment you might hear an epic poem recited from memory, the next a fiery rant against tax hikes. And always, always, a stream of thick, tar-like coffee anchoring the moment. Historians still argue whether these spaces were primarily cultural forums or political threats in disguise. The truth is, probably both. Some were literary hubs where aspiring poets performed for coins or favors. Others were hotbeds of dissent, where reformers whispered under the din of clinking cups. Occasionally a scribe or spy would quietly slip out and inform the authorities, just in case the coffee being served came with a little too much rebellion. You pick your way through the room, careful not to step on a game board or someone's discarded turban, and sit beside a man with ink-stained fingers. He eyes you, nods toward the back, and mutters something about shadow puppets at dawn. Sounds cryptic, but oddly appropriate. Yes, shadow puppetry. You weren't expecting that, were you? One of the stranger offshoots of coffeehouse culture was the karagöz and hasivat performances, Ottoman shadow plays that often took place right here between sips and smoke rings. These comic duels between a clever rogue and a pompous bureaucrat poked fun at everything from marriage to military campaigns. The crowd loved them. They were the sitcoms of the empire, but with more donkeys and sly jabs at authority. Some kahvehanes were even known for regular puppet seasons, drawing in crowds who came less for the caffeine and more for the satire. It's like watching The Daily Show, but from behind a sheet, lit by an oil lamp. You laugh quietly as you sip, imagining someone trying to cancel a puppet in 1583. Not likely. Though coffee houses themselves were definitely canceled from time to time. Yes, banned. Multiple times, actually. You step back outside, blinking as the morning light pierces through the mist. Across the centuries, sultans issued periodic decrees shutting down coffee houses, fearing they stirred unrest or distracted men from prayer. One ruler even had kavahani windows bricked over and coffee drinkers publicly punished. Dramatic? Oh, extremely. But just as quickly as the bans came, the people found workarounds. Underground cafes, secret deliveries, fake ink houses where nothing was written and everything was brewed. Ottoman coffee culture was persistent, maybe even petty in the best possible way. Historians still argue whether the bans were about religion, politics, or simple paranoia, but you don't need a textbook to see the pattern. Ban something people love and you've just made it sacred. And speaking of sacred, your next step brings you to a mosque courtyard. Quiet, serene, a different kind of gathering place. Here you find another curious facet of Ottoman coffee life. The religious scholars who debated whether drinking coffee was a sin. No joke. In the early years, as the drink spread through the Islamic world, some clerics were suspicious. Was coffee an intoxicant? Did it disrupt prayer? Did the way it was consumed in loud, laughing gatherings make it a distraction from God? But just as many scholars defended it. They argued that coffee kept the mind sharp for studying sacred texts and helped worshippers stay awake for long nights of dhikr, remembrance. Some even considered it a blessed gift, comparing its bitterness to life's trials and its aroma to divine mystery. It became such a heated issue that imperial courts had to step in. One sultan even convened a special religious council to decide coffee's fate. The verdict? Officially permissible. Unofficially, well, let's just say not everyone followed the ruling. You feel your cup growing warm again in your hands, as if the debate is still simmering. And in some ways it is. Think of all the modern debates over caffeine, health, morality, productivity. Turns out we're still arguing over beans. You wander now to a quieter corner of the city, a small courtyard tucked behind a hammam. A fountain trickles lazily, and a few merchants chat beside sacks of cardamom, cinnamon, and clove. Here you find the unsung heroes of the coffee world, the spice traders and grinders. Before there were electric burr mills or vacuum-sealed tins, there were hours of hand grinding, roasting, sifting, and measuring. Each kvetchi had a preferred blend, often protected like state secrets. Some used dried rose petals for aroma. Others added crushed mastic or a hint of anise. There were regional preferences too. Arab-style kahwa, Bosnian jezva, or Syrian cardamom-heavy brews. One fringe recipe included the bark of the carob tree. Not popular, but apparently good for the digestion, depending on who you asked. And, of course, the grinding process itself was almost meditative. It was said that the finest kavesi could hear the perfect pitch of readiness in the beans. Like a coffee whisperer. Can you imagine applying for that job today? Do you hear the grind? Yes? You're hired. You smile watching a young apprentice fumble with a brass grinder. He'll get it someday. For now, he sweeps the scattered grounds into a copper tray with more care than most people treat their phones. The cup in your hand is now nearly empty again, just a swirl of sediment whispering its riddles. But you don't feel ready to stop. Not while the echoes of debate and song still stir the cobblestones. Not while there's one more layer to uncover. Because you realize coffee in the Ottoman world wasn't just about flavor or energy. It was about power, ritual, conversation, resistance, intimacy, humor, identity. And somewhere in this mess of steam and chatter and puppets, it became a mirror of the empire, of its people, of you. You tip the last drops into your mouth, not rushing. The next cup will come. It always does. Your shoes crunch softly on the mosaic tiles as you move again, this time toward the edge of the imperial kitchens. Not the public cafes or the shadowy coffeehouses now, but the royal kitchens, where the air buzzes with cinnamon, smoke, and the quiet terror of disappointing a sultan. Here coffee was not merely brewed, it was choreographed. There was an entire hierarchy, an official position, the kahvetsi basha, or chief coffee maker of the sultan. A man whose job involved waking before everyone else, roasting with sacred precision, and delivering the first heavenly sips to the imperial lips. And yes, this role came with robes, influence, and occasionally, the power to whisper into ears that decided the fate of provinces. Historians still argue whether the Kaveci Bashu held true political power, or if his influence was more symbolic. But given how often these coffee chiefs were promoted to other high-ranking posts, you start to suspect they knew more than just how to boil water. You stand near one such man now, watching him measure beans like they're relics. The grind is soft but deliberate, the sesve waiting patiently on hot sand. There's no fire, just heat from below and an uncanny stillness. When the foam rises, he doesn't blink. He lifts the pot smoothly, lets it settle, then returns it for a second bloom. 3 foams. That's the ritual, not 2. Never 4. 3. It's not just about taste, it's about respect. Serving underfoamed coffee was a scandal in elite circles. In fact, in some noble homes, guests could silently judge a host's honor based on the quality of crema. No pressure or anything. And let's not forget the presentation. You glance down at a tray lined with filigree, tiny spoons made from mother of pearl, sugar cubes shaped like roses, and napkins embroidered with verses from Persian poetry. Not embroidered in a hallmarky way, like calligraphy that took weeks. There's a knock at the door, sharp, quick, practiced. A eunuch glides in, takes the tray without a word, and vanishes. Somewhere deep in the Topkapi Palace, that coffee is already halfway to the Sultan's lips. You follow in a dreamlike drift and find yourself now in the women's quarters. Yes, the harem. Let's get this straight. The harem wasn't just about lounging beauties and scandalous silks. It was a political, educational, and social institution. A world of power brokers and silk slippers. And coffee flowed through this world too. Quietly, gracefully, with more consequence than you might expect. Here the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, sips her cup with slow elegance, deciding who among the younger concubines gets tutoring and who might receive, well, a certain invitation. Coffee in this intimate space becomes almost like incense, something that cloaks decisions in flavor and ritual. Conversations unfold in a coded language of eyebrow twitches and cup tilts. Serving a cup too bitter might hint at offense. Too sweet? Flattery or worse? Mockery. Historians still debate how widespread or formalized these practices were. Some accounts are more legend than ledger, but the atmosphere you're standing in now, soft light through lattice screens, the scent of clove and oud, the quiet crackle of conversation, makes it all feel completely real. You move from the harem to the garden terrace where yet another scene plays out, the diplomatic coffee ceremony. This was where foreign ambassadors were greeted, not with contracts, not even with swords, but with coffee. The ritual went like this. An official, often a vizier, would receive the guest under a canopy surrounded by fountains or tiled walls. Coffee was brought out in jewel-inlaid cups, each movement practiced. There were specific phrases, hand gestures, eye contact rules. The brew was strong, slightly bitter, symbolizing sincerity and seriousness. If the visitor received only 1 cup, it meant, let's talk. If 2 were served, respect and affection. No coffee at all. Someone's in trouble. You sit beside an imaginary ambassador now, watching him fumble the tiny porcelain handle as he tries to remember whether sipping before the host was rude or respectful. You can practically feel his stress. One fringe detail? In at least one documented case, a European emissary attempted to refuse the coffee due to personal distaste, and was politely asked to leave and return when he had more manners. Yes, coffee snobbery was alive and well long before Yelp reviews. The Ottomans believed in the symbolism of hospitality, and nothing embodied that better than coffee. It wasn't just a drink, it was a contract of civility, a token of mutual recognition. You didn't serve coffee to someone you planned to betray, unless, of course, you were very good at lying. The tray is cleared, the guests depart. You hear the courtyard birds beginning to sing, the kind of sound that wraps around you like a soft scarf. The empire is always shifting, always sipping, and then, just as you settle in, you hear a murmur from behind the tapestry. Back in the palace library now, where one more secret lies hidden in the steam. Because there's still one element we haven't quite talked about, the literary one. You turn the corner and find shelves, scrolls, and manuscripts filled not with law or war, but with coffee poetry. Yes, poetry. Entire collections dedicated to the aroma, bitterness, and emotional trajectory of a single cup. Love poems, satire, even spiritual reflections comparing the rise of foam to the awakening of the soul. One semi-obscure 17th century poet rhymed bitterness with forgiveness and claimed that drinking a muddy cup after a heartbreak was the closest he'd ever come to enlightenment. Okay, that one might have been having a moment. Still, it speaks to the truth of this entire journey. Coffee wasn't peripheral in the Ottoman Empire. It was central. It was ritual. Political theater, gossip grease, a canvas for every mood and moment. And in the dim light of the library, where the smell of old paper mingles with ghostly roast, you sit cross-legged on the carpet, a steaming cup in hand, and realize you haven't blinked in hours, but you feel calm, balanced, curious. You reach for another book, another brew. Let the empire steep a little longer. You're still in the palace library, knees tucked beneath you on a worn kilim rug, surrounded by the soft susurrus of old parchment and whispered memories. That last cup has long since cooled, its grounds clinging in half-moons at the bottom, daring you to interpret them. But you're not quite in the mood to divine your fate from residue. Instead, you rise, stepping past a half-ajar lattice door that spills golden afternoon light onto a stone corridor. Your feet lead you, almost of their own accord, to a different arena of power. One not ruled by princes or poets, but by merchants. Because beyond the palace walls, Ottoman coffee culture thrives in the bustling heart of Istanbul's bazaars and commercial districts, where coin jingles, tongues wag, and steam swirls like smoke from a magician's robe. You're standing now in the great Kapalı Çarşı, the Grand Bazaar, where among silks and spices and glinting daggers, coffee has carved out a home of its own. This isn't the shadowy mystery of the imperial court. It's loud, chaotic, sticky with life. Sellers shout, cats nap. Somewhere someone's haggling with such intensity, you're not sure whether they're selling fabric or challenging each other to a duel. And amid all this madness, there are kahve handler, public coffee houses, tucked into corners, archways, and sometimes just wide alleyways with stools and brass trays. You step into one that smells of cardamom and old stories. Men sit shoulder to shoulder on benches, drinking dark, thick brews that look like they could dissolve a horseshoe if left unattended. Coffee here is currency, but not for trade. It buys time, connection, gossip, strategy. One man flips prayer beads around his wrist, nodding along to another recounting his cousin's run-in with a particularly dramatic camel. Across the room, a young scribe scribbles letters with inky fingers, cup balanced dangerously close to the parchment. Mainstream history often describes these spaces as the nerve centers of public life, particularly in urban Ottoman society. They were sometimes the only public spaces where news flowed freely, unchained by the stiff etiquette of the court. The first place you'd hear about a new edict or a royal birth, or that rogue goat who keeps escaping the butcher's stall. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some early coffee houses had designated storytellers, professional narrators who would read aloud epic tales, political satire, or weirdly detailed accounts of local ghost sightings. These guys weren't just background noise, they were stars, drawing in crowds like human Netflix algorithms, spinning plot lines more addictive than a cup of hot brew at dawn. You slip onto a stool and watch one such storyteller begin. His voice is gravel-dusted silk, his arms sweeping like sails in a storm. His coffee remains untouched on the table. It's not fuel, it's punctuation. He's telling a story about a djinn who challenges a merchant to a chess game, and it's unclear who's cheating more. Historians still argue whether these Kavahani storytellers were officially tolerated or seen as dangerous agitators. Some sultans loved them, others tried to ban them outright. Apparently, a really good parable could start a riot if the metaphor hit too close to someone's imperial nerve. And that perhaps is the most powerful thing about these spaces. They weren't just about caffeine, they were about expression, which also made them suspicious. You lean back against the rough plastered wall and remember that coffee wasn't always a safe sip in the empire. Several times throughout Ottoman history, coffee houses were shut down under royal decree, sometimes because of religious opposition, sometimes due to fears of sedition, sometimes just because a sultan got bad press from a guy with too much caffeine and a big mouth. In 1656, Grand Vizier Köprülü Mehmed Pasha led one of the more famous crackdowns. Coffee houses were shuttered, some were burned. Heavy fines were imposed on repeat offenders. But did it work? You peek out the window. There's another Kavehani right across the alley. And a third one down the street. Yeah, no, it definitely didn't work. In fact, some scholars say these crackdowns only made the culture more resilient, more secretive. Like coffee-fueled speakeasies, passwords and knock patterns. There's even fringe speculation that one of these hidden joints had a trapdoor to hide the sesvi during police raids. We're not saying it's definitely true, but isn't it more fun to imagine it was? You sip another cup, this one served by a teen with a smudged apron, and more swagger than you thought was legally allowed. He winks at you and yells your order before you say it. You wonder, not for the first time, if he's psychic, or just very good at his job. And as you watch the people, real people, not palace courtiers or mythic poets, you start to understand something. This isn't just a drink. It's a glue, a spark, a rite. You could strip away half the luxuries of this empire, but as long as someone has a bean and a brazier, Ottoman society would still manage to gather, debate, laugh, and maybe even conspire. You walk out of the coffee house and the sunlight blinds you momentarily, bouncing off the white stone. You blink, and now you're outside the city walls in a sleepy village where coffee's journey looks different, but still feels just as vital. An old woman grinds beans by hand, elbow creaking in rhythm. Children run by barefoot and someone's playing a reed flute badly but enthusiastically. The kesve hangs above a clay stove, and you realize, here, even without libraries or palaces or poets, the coffee ritual is still sacred. She pours you a cup, smiles without saying a word. You sit on a rock, the breeze stirring your hair like a lullaby. The empire, in all its sprawling chaos, begins to feel small and soft and almost personal. And the coffee? Still strong, still bitter, still perfect. You lean back on that sun-warmed stone just a little longer, letting the flavor of the coffee linger on your tongue, the grounds clinging to your teeth like some stubborn souvenir. Around you, the village slows. A donkey brays somewhere in the distance. Someone is roasting chickpeas. It smells vaguely of firewood, toasted flour, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny pinch of nutmeg someone swears is their grandmother's secret. But your journey's not done yet. You rise, stretching limbs heavy with caffeine and contentment, and begin walking again. Past fields, past fountains, past roadside shrines and sleepy sheep. And as the breeze shifts, it brings with it the scent of the sea and the subtle waft of clove-scented smoke. You follow it like a sleepwalking pilgrim, right into the heart of port cities where the coffee trade truly flexed its international muscle. Because while Ottoman coffee houses were rich with culture and conversation, It was the empire's trade networks that made sure everyone had beans to brew and bribe with. You're stepping now into the docks of Izmir or Smyrna, as some preferred to call it, a city that once pulsed with the frenzy of merchant ships, horse caravans, and multilingual shouting matches. The harbor is a chaos of crates and curses. You squeeze past an Armenian spice dealer arguing with a Venetian sailor over nutmeg weights, then duck as a sack of dates nearly topples from a cart. And there, tucked between amphorae and bundles of silk, are burlap sacks filled with the one thing everyone's eyeing like it's treasure: coffee, raw green beans, traded by the ton, brought up from the port of Mocha in Yemen, funneled through Red Sea routes and across desert paths. It's said the Ottomans controlled this trade so tightly that beans were boiled or partially roasted before export to prevent planting elsewhere. Historians still argue whether this was a myth inflated by colonial rivals or a brilliantly bitter act of monopoly. And yet, despite their best efforts, smuggling happened. European powers wanted in. The Dutch tried sneaking live plants out in the 1600s. The French followed soon after, and somewhere out there in a forgotten customs log is probably a footnote about some guy hiding a coffee sprout in his wig powder. But back in Ottoman territory, the coffee trade wasn't just about maritime daring. It was about bureaucracy, too. Coffee was taxed, regulated, and in some cases, heavily scrutinized. Coffeehouses, as you've already seen, were subject to raids and closures, but merchants had their own headaches. Overzealous inspectors, price controls, tariffs that read like poetry riddled with percentage signs. Still, the trade persisted and flourished, and coffee didn't just move out of Ottoman ports. It came in from everywhere, along with all the things people like to put into their coffee. Sugar from Egypt, cinnamon from Ceylon, porcelain from China. You pass one cafe that proudly displays an absurdly delicate coffee cup, no handle, paper thin, resting in a gilded zarf, that decorative metal sleeve that kept fingers from burning and style points from plummeting. You're ushered into a merchant's house by a beaming host who insists you join him for a brief chat. You sit down and realize that in Ottoman etiquette, brief can mean an entire afternoon, 3 courses, a poem recital, and someone's son attempting a dance. The merchant proudly pours you a cup of white coffee, a milky blend sweetened to near dessert levels. He claims it's all the rage now among visiting French diplomats. You sip it and feel like your teeth are writing you a stern letter. You try not to grimace. He laughs. Coffee trends apparently were just as volatile back then. Some preferred bitter, some sweet. Some added cardamom, others a pinch of salt. Yes, salt. A fringe habit from Eastern Anatolia, or maybe just the prank of a bored waiter with too much time and too little adult supervision. One thing is clear: coffee was as much a cultural performance as it was a beverage, and nowhere was that more evident than in how it was served during negotiations. You watch as another merchant, this one clad in flowing robes with a mustache so sharp it could slice baklava, enters the room. Before anyone says a word, a servant brings in 2 cups, not for hydration, not for refreshment, but for theater. The men sit, the cups rest, they wait. This is a moment of dance when the aroma speaks first, then the silence, then the gestures. Only then do the merchants talk. Historians often note how Ottoman diplomacy was inseparable from hospitality, and coffee, warm and deliberate, played a central role. It slowed things down, forced pauses, created space for eyes to meet and tempers to settle. Imagine trying to declare war while sipping from a tiny cup with a floral saucer. It's much harder than you think. One account, possibly apocryphal but deliciously detailed, tells of a British envoy who tried to gulp down his coffee in one swig, only to spill grounds all over his lap and be silently judged by an entire divan council. For the record, he was wearing white. There's also a lesser-known tidbit that during tense treaty talks, Ottoman diplomats would carefully adjust the coffee's strength and sugar levels depending on who they were dealing with. Sweet for flatterers, bitter for rivals. It's a kind of caffeinated diplomacy the modern world could still learn from. Imagine the UN Security Council breaking into Turkish coffee service instead of more meetings. World peace might be only 2 sips away. As the merchants around you continue their theatrical commerce, you realize how effortlessly coffee bridges the personal and the political here. It's not just a household habit or a noble indulgence, it's a lubricant for everything from street gossip to global treaties. And yet, no matter how far the empire's trade extended, from Cairo to Sarajevo, from Baghdad to Belgrade, the coffee always came back to the same thing: a small, dark cup, a quiet moment, an invitation. You walk outside again, past the wharf, past the clamor of scales and ledgers, and into a dusky evening thick with mist. Ships creak at their moorings, lanterns flicker in iron sconces, and somewhere nearby a young deckhand cradles a brass sesve over a tiny flame, waiting for the foam to rise just right. He's not a merchant, not a diplomat, not a poet. Just tired, just human. Just waiting for a cup of comfort in a world that even then moved far too fast. You trail away from the harbor, your shoes tapping lightly against cobblestone as you follow the curling scent of roasted beans inland. It's dusk now, and the wind shifts again, this time carrying not just coffee, but bread, lamb fat, and a chorus of tavern flutes struggling to harmonize through someone's drunken hiccups. Behind you, trade routes snake out into the night, toward Persia, toward Venice, toward Vienna. But you're moving toward quieter, softer scenes, toward the hidden heart of the empire, into the homes where coffee wasn't traded, debated, or taxed, but lived. You duck beneath a low wooden archway. It creaks like it has complaints. Inside, a small courtyard glows gold from a lantern swinging slightly in the breeze. A cat darts past. 2 older women sit side by side on a woven mat, gossiping in tones so low they sound like bees muttering bedtime stories. One of them glances up and smiles. She gestures you closer, and just like that, you're inside a traditional Ottoman home. Not a palace, not a governor's residence, just a lived-in space. Low ceilings, plaster walls, embroidered cushions. A few copper pots hang above a hearth. The coffee pot, sesve, always a sesve, sits perched on a bed of ash. She lifts it like it's an heirloom, which it probably is. Because here coffee isn't about ceremony, it's about rhythm. Morning, noon, or night, it marks the day. It helps pass time or stall it. It invites conversation even if the words never rise above a whisper. You sit cross-legged as she pours, the foam dense and velvety. Her hands are steady, her smile mischievous. "Don't move," she warns, grinning. "The grounds have to settle." You freeze. It's a familiar dance now. Wait, sip, breathe. And then she leans in, eyes twinkling, and begins to read your fortune. Yes, Ottoman coffee wasn't complete without tassiography. Coffee cup divination. Once you'd finished your brew, you'd flip the cup over onto its saucer, let the ground slide and drip, then hand it to someone who, with all the gravitas of a Shakespearean ghost, would interpret the muddy chaos left inside. That shape? A camel. You're going on a journey. That swirl, an eye? Someone's watching you. That blob? Definitely a fish, and yes, that means good news. Historians still argue whether tassiography emerged directly from Ottoman culture or was absorbed from earlier traditions in Persia or the Levant. What's clear is that it took off like wildfire, especially among women who often weren't invited to coffeehouses but found in this ritual their own social haven. You sip your coffee and stare into the cup, pretending you see a majestic phoenix and not what clearly looks like someone's dropped spaghetti. Your host insists you'll marry rich. You nod solemnly. You also wonder if she tells everyone that. But it's not about accuracy, really. It's about connection, about spinning stories from silt, about peering into something dark and mysterious, even if it's just old caffeine pretending to be fate. The room buzzes with quiet laughter. Another woman joins in. Someone opens a window, letting in the smell of night jasmine and warm stone. You catch snatches of conversation. Worries about crops, about dowries, about whether Mustafa is too lazy to deserve a second chance. And you realize this is another kind of coffee house. One without a sign or a tax ledger. One built from silence and comfort, not spectacle. Here, coffee isn't performed, it's lived. A child toddles in with a sticky hand and an empty stomach. Someone hands them a bite of honey-drenched pastry, lakma, still warm. You eat one too. It melts instantly like a kiss made of syrup. Coffee in Ottoman homes wasn't just about the drink, it was about the table, or more often the tray. Always metal, always round, often engraved with stars or vines. On it, cups, a water glass, maybe dates, sometimes sweets. Occasionally a bowl of cloves or mastic, meant to freshen breath before or after the coffee, because you don't want your fortune told with dragon breath. But more than objects, there were gestures. The way a host folded the napkin, the order of serving, the quiet rule that elders drank first, the respectful pause after the first sip. Even the smallest deviation could raise an eyebrow or spark an inside joke. And for those observing more formal customs, especially in households near the capital, there were strict expectations. The coffee had to be hot, the foam intact, the presentation elegant. Serving a guest bitter or sloppily made coffee, that wasn't just rude, it was a subtle insult. And depending on the company, it could start a family Cold War that might last until someone's sheep wandered into the wrong garden and forced reconciliation. Of course, homes weren't the only places where domestic rituals bloomed. Coffee also wove into weddings, births, and funerals. At weddings, it signaled approval or disapproval. Picture this. A groom-to-be visits his bride's family. The bride serves him coffee. If she likes him, she makes it sweet. If she doesn't, she salts it like seawater. He drinks either way, heroically, with the expression of someone who just swallowed a dare. At births, coffee was brewed to mark the return to normal life, a sign that the mother was well enough to host again, to rejoin the domestic rhythm. And at funerals, coffee helped bridge the awkward quiet. It gave hands something to do, mouths something to sip, and hearts a small, bitter comfort in the face of grief. One fringe practice from rural areas even involved pouring a small cup and leaving it at a loved one's grave, an offering not just of memory but of presence. A gesture of, I remember you. I still drink with you. Outside, the stars begin to multiply. You slip from the courtyard with a quiet wave. Your host nods, knowingly, as if to say, you'll be back. The grounds promised. You walk slowly now, eyes adjusting to the dark. The empire quiets with you. Cities sleep, ships creak, animals nestle into hay. But somewhere behind almost every shuttered window, there's a kesve, a tray, a packet of beans, waiting to begin the ritual again. Because here coffee isn't a moment, it's a thread, running through kitchens, over centuries, binding people who never met, never spoke, but shared the same need, to pause, to sip, to be human. You step quietly through the narrow alleys now, the air thick with that deep midnight calm only ancient cities seem to master. There's still a faint smell of roasted beans in the air, either from your memory or from another hearth, keeping the night warm somewhere behind those crumbling plaster walls. Your path brings you close to a quieter part of the city, where courtyards are fewer, and the domes and minarets rise like silent sentinels in the moonlight. But here, something unusual pulls your gaze. A tall, shadowed wall, unmarked, but with the faintest flicker of movement inside. You edge closer, and just like that, you're standing at the invisible doorstep of an Ottoman coffee guild. Yes, guild, like knights, but for coffee. Because in this empire, the drink wasn't just brewed, it was mastered, guarded, perfected. Inside, you glimpse men bent over sacks of green beans, sorting them with hands like sculptors. Others hover near giant pans, slowly roasting the beans over open flame, each with a slightly different rhythm and color to match the blend. Yemeni, Ethiopian, or a rare coastal variety that supposedly made your heart beat in iambic pentameter. You've stumbled into a lost world of coffee artisans. The Ahilic system, Ottoman-era guilds rooted in Islamic ethics and medieval fraternity, governed trades from shoemaking to swordsmithing. But the coffee guilds were especially respected. Their members were called Kaveshi Ustası, or master coffee makers. They didn't just know how to roast, they knew how to buy, how to bribe, how to detect fake beans by smell alone, and how to serve coffee that could melt the suspicions off a sultan's brow. Apprenticeship took years. A boy might enter at 12 and not be trusted with real customers until his beard was full and his opinions minimal. These masters had secret roasting methods, secret supply routes, and in at least one case, secret handshakes involving a coffee spoon and a meaningful eyebrow twitch. Historians still argue whether these coffee guilds acted more like trade unions or underground fraternities. Some believe they had political influence, shaping price control and even advising ministers in secret. Others think they were glorified bean clubs with robes and really good snacks. Either way, they mattered, and they enforced standards. A cup of coffee too sour? That vendor might find themselves blacklisted from major markets. Serve from dirty pots? Expect a polite visit with stern eyebrows and revoked access to the bean auctions. Speaking of auctions, yes, coffee was auctioned. In Istanbul, one of the main bean markets was near Tatakala, where shiploads from Yemen were unloaded, catalogued, and bickered over by men with ledgers and opinions sharper than their mustaches. You imagine the scene. Long robes swishing, hands gesturing furiously, tiny cups passed around like currency. A single kilo of superior mocha beans might fetch the kind of price that made someone's week or their whole year if they diluted it enough back home. And dilution, by the way, was both an art and a scandal. Adding chicory, ground date pits, or even roasted barley was common in lean times. But too much, that was fraud. You could lose your stall or your eyebrows if local vigilante coffee snobs had anything to say about it. One particularly odd practice that you hear whispered about involved chewing the raw beans before roasting to test for freshness. The taste, they said, told you how well it would roast. It also presumably told you that your teeth hated you. Of course, not every aspect of guild life was rigid. There were moments of flair, too. Some Kavesi Ustası developed personal flairs, like balancing the tezve on a blade, or twirling the long-handled spoon with ridiculous flourish before pouring. One fringe tale, possibly myth, possibly just passed around to scare apprentices, tells of a master who once roasted coffee beans over fire made from stolen palace scrolls. The bureaucracy, he said, adds a smoky bitterness. You believe it. But beyond flair and showmanship, these guilds held power. They helped shape trade policy, resisted excessive taxation, and at times even formed their own protective brotherhoods when government efforts threatened to regulate too harshly. It was a delicate balance between empire and entrepreneur, between art and business. And when things got tense, guilds had a secret weapon: public opinion, because Ottoman citizens took their coffee seriously. An unfair bean tax could spark riots, a restriction on imports? Don't even try it. There's a famous case during Sultan Murad IV's reign, he's the one you might remember from earlier, with a slight caffeine control obsession, where coffeehouses were banned again. But even his own viziers kept secret stashes, and whispers from the guilds ensured that, despite public prohibition, private roasting continued like clockwork. You wonder what modern health inspectors would make of the shared spoons, the open pans, the fly-infested rooftops where beans were sometimes left to dry. But you also wonder if anything they made today would match the taste crafted in those smoky, perfumed shops. Some say the coffee tasted better because it was earned. Some say the flavor came from the charcoal, and some say it's all nostalgia. That if you drank it today, you'd spit it out and ask for oat milk. But nostalgia is its own kind of brew, isn't it? You leave the guild unseen, stepping back into the cool air of the night. The streets are emptier now, but not asleep. Just listening. Somewhere, a door creaks open. Someone pours a final cup. Somewhere else, a couple argues softly over the last piece of baklava. And you? You're starting to feel it. The warmth of the drink still in your chest. The echo of a trade built on trust, tradition, and a whole lot of trial and error. And whether the guilds were benevolent artists or bean-hoarding monarchists, you can't deny they cared. They made coffee not just something to drink it, but something to believe in. You drift past the guild's hidden entry, the air now touched with a more subdued note, like ash from a hearth that's gone quiet. The empire is winding down around you, not collapsing, just softening. And in the quiet, you begin to notice something different. A feminine laugh, gentle behind a silk-draped doorway, the scent of orange blossom, and the delicate clink of porcelain far more refined than the rough clay mugs of the coffee stalls. Because tonight you're invited into a harem. Not for drama, not for scandal, but for coffee. Yes, the Ottoman harem, long misunderstood by Westerners as nothing more than a palace of indulgence, actually functioned more like a sophisticated, female-driven government branch. The women inside weren't just waiting for a sultan, they were shaping court culture. And coffee, as always, was right at the center. You slip inside quietly. No one seems to notice, or perhaps they do and just don't care. Either way, you're lucky. Silken pillows are piled high. Carved screens break the room into shifting shadows. There's a brazier glowing in the corner, and over it, a pot, more delicate than the CSVs in the shops, gilded at the lip and perfumed with a hint of cardamom. This is coffee as ritual, performed exclusively by women of the palace. Chief among them, the Kaveti Usta Kadın, the female master of coffee, appointed within the harem hierarchy. Her role was as important as it was subtle, preparing coffee for the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, for visiting dignitaries and for the Sultan himself, should he choose to honor the harem with a rare, relaxed visit. And like their guild counterparts in the bazaar, these women trained extensively. A mistake, too bitter, too cold, served before the appointed phrase, could spark offense. A perfect cup? It might smooth over a political feud or earn a nod from the most powerful matron in the empire. Historians still argue whether these women wielded direct political power through such acts of service, or if their influence was purely symbolic. But it's hard to ignore the pattern. Harem women were often deeply informed, socially connected, and more than capable of leveraging their roles in private hospitality for public outcomes. A cup of coffee, passed from a respected consort to a visiting minister, might carry more weight than a scroll bearing the Sultan's seal. And no, not just because the minister really needed a caffeine boost. You settle among the cushions, letting the warmth of the brazier soothe your bones, and you watch. Coffee is ground fresh, using a brass mill that takes strength to turn. The powder is measured, and not with spoons, but with practiced fingertips. Water is drawn, cooled, poured, and stirred counterclockwise 3 times. Why counterclockwise? Some say it stirs away bad omens. Others say it's just a personal preference that stuck. The brew begins to foam. Good sign. Foam means the coffee is alive. It's breathing. It's thinking about telling you your future. And here's where it gets especially fun. Because once the coffee is drunk, carefully, slowly, with just enough slurping to show appreciation, the real magic begins. Tasseography. Cup reading. Fortune-telling. One of the women, younger than the rest, but with eyes that could see through your soul, takes the empty finken, flips it over on its saucer, and waits. When the grounds settle, she lifts the cup and peers inside. To your left, a sultan's silhouette. Perhaps the young heir's path is troubled. To your right, a serpent. Beware jealousy. In the center, a fish. Ah, prosperity. Or maybe just hunger? This tradition didn't originate with the Ottomans, but they certainly turned it into an art. Coffee reading wasn't exclusive to harems. It flourished in neighborhoods and courtyards too. But within the palace, it became a tool of subtle communication, a way to pass hopes, hints, or warnings when formal speech wasn't safe. And the women of the harem, they mastered it. They whispered futures to one another while watching over the empire's future sons. They predicted betrayals with the tip of a finger and a streak of residue. One fringe theory claims the Valide Sultan once changed her political strategy after seeing a crocodile-shaped stain at the bottom of her cup. You're not sure if it's true, but you kind of hope it is. There's a joy here, a secret language. Something often overlooked when history books talk about harems and palace life. These women weren't just locked away, they were curators of culture, arbiters of style, and yes, professional level baristas with serious talent. And while much of the male dominated world outside brewed coffee with pomp and fire, the women here offered softness, precision, whispered ritual. One small detail you almost miss: how every cup is served with the handle facing a certain direction, customized to the receiver's dominant hand. It's a micro gesture, but one that says, I know you, I see you. Imagine getting that kind of attention at your local cafe. There were even certain coffee scents used to signal unspoken messages. A touch of rosewater for romance. A hint of clove to communicate quiet morning. Orange blossom like tonight? Some say it meant contentment, or maybe mischief. You let yourself imagine being part of this hidden world, not as a ruler or a servant, but as an honored guest free to sip and speculate. Your cup, like theirs, a reflection not just of beans and water, but of emotion, power, and possibility. The laughter has quieted now. A breeze rustles the silks. Someone is humming a tune that sounds like the shadow of a lullaby, and as you stand to leave, you glance once more at the empty cups on the tray. Their rims stained, their saucers smudged. Like tiny moons, each hiding a story waiting to be poured. Read, believed. It's enough to make you believe too. That coffee in the Ottoman Empire wasn't merely a habit. It was a medium, a language. And here in the hidden heart of the palace, that language was spoken best by the women who rarely got to write the history, but still found ways to stir it. The palace doors ease shut behind you, and you find yourself back on the cobbled street, beneath a sky dimming to lavender. But there's one more stop before sleep can truly take you. Because while the court and the bazaar shaped the formality of Ottoman coffee culture, it was in the homes, tucked behind vines and carved wooden shutters, that coffee lived its fullest, slowest, and most meaningful life. You wander through a quieter district now. The lamps here aren't oil-fed showpieces, but modest, flickering globes swinging gently outside homes. The scent is different too. Less spiced, more earthy. Roasted nuts, dry wood smoke, and the unmistakable trace of freshly ground beans coming from somewhere very close. A door opens, and as luck would have it, you're invited in. You step into a low-lit parlor filled with the warm clutter of a real, lived-in space. There are shoes left at the door, cushions mismatched on purpose. A painted tile cracked down one side but stubbornly clinging to its place on the wall. This is no royal chamber or bustling coffee house, it's a family home. And here the coffee ritual takes a new shape. Slower, more personal, and bound by custom, just as firm as any guild's handbook. The hostess greets you with a practiced smile and a short bow of the head. She asks softly, how many sugars? No sugar, are you sure? There's a pause, then she nods. Respects your questionable taste, and sets to work. In Ottoman households, hosting coffee wasn't optional. It was an unspoken duty and a shared joy. Guests, even unexpected ones like you, were treated with a blend of warmth and mild formality. The coffee served here wasn't just a drink. It was a gesture of respect. A contract, really. You're welcome, you're safe. Stay as long as you need. And as in court or market, there was etiquette. Always serve elders first. Never let a guest's cup go empty. Always present the coffee with the right hand, never the left. A minor offense in a royal court, perhaps, but in a small home? It could mean a mother-in-law's lifelong grudge. And no amount of cinnamon could fix that. One mainstream tradition practiced here was the coffee serving test for brides. Yes, that was real. When a suitor came calling, the bride-to-be would prepare and serve coffee to his family. Her brewing skills weren't just about flavor, they were read like tea leaves. Did she pour too quickly? She might be impulsive. Did she forget sugar? Uncaring? Did she give her future father-in-law the smallest cup? Oh no. But there was a twist. Sometimes the bride would add salt instead of sugar to the groom's cup to test his temperament. Did he drink it with a smile? Husband material. Did he spit it out? Back to the matchmaking board. Historians still argue whether this salt trick was widespread or mostly anecdotal, passed along as folkloric mischief. Either way, it continues in many modern Turkish homes, a small prank with big implications, and possibly ruined taste buds. As the coffee begins to bubble, you watch the sezvi tremble slightly in the hostess's hand. Not from nerves, this isn't her first pot, but from years of experience reading the boil like a storm glass. She lifts it just in time, then lets the foam settle, then boils again. This triple boil method is considered the hallmark of excellence. One boil and you're in a hurry. Two and you're close. Three and you care. She pours carefully into small cups, porcelain now, not metal, and places them on a round brass tray. Next to each, a tiny square of lokum, Turkish delight, dusted in powdered sugar. You've seen it in shops, sure, but here it's not candy. It's hospitality, sweetness, and old family recipes passed down with no measuring cups, just instinct and whispers. You sip, and yes, it's different again. There's a richness here, less fiery than the market brew, less perfumed than the palace cup. It's mellow, deep, with a finish that lingers like a lullaby hummed from the next room. Around you, family life stirs. Children patter behind curtains. Someone coughs gently from another room. The quiet clink of dishes being dried. The rhythm of life continuing around the edges of the ritual. And you begin to realize, in this home and in 1,000 others across the Ottoman world, from Edirne to Damascus to Cairo, coffee wasn't a luxury or a trend. It was the anchor, a way to pause, connect, reflect, a daily act of comfort that somehow remained sacred no matter how often repeated. One fringe theory? That Ottoman coffee customs, especially those passed through households, spread across borders faster than trade routes themselves, carried not by merchants but by exiled families, runaway daughters, widows turned travelers. That's right, coffee diplomacy with a shawl and a suitcase. And if true, it makes sense. Because culture doesn't always march forward in silk robes and military drums. Sometimes it tiptoes, in worn slippers, carrying a tray with trembling cups. The hostess refills your drink without asking. A small smile. The sun has dipped fully now, casting the room into shades of honey and smoke. You drink slower this time, savoring the bitter sweetness, letting it warm not just your hands, but your memory. You think back through the whole night, markets and palaces, shadows and whispers, foam and fortune-telling, and it all leads here. To a table set not by rank or guild or harem hierarchy, but by the simple rule of care. You're a guest, you're welcome. And your coffee will never go cold. The hostess rises to collect the cups, but not before offering one last gesture, turning yours upside down onto its saucer. A final wink at fate. You leave quietly, stepping back into the sleepy street, where even the cats seem to have curled up for the night. Your breath fogs slightly in the cool air. Somewhere in the distance, a shop shutter closes with a soft thud. And as you walk, you realize 400 years of history, of politics and poetry, of intrigue and inheritance, of rituals passed through both power and poverty, could all be traced in the swirl of dark grounds at the bottom of a tiny porcelain cup. Word count, 1,084. Wind down, 300 words. And now, we ease away from the steam, from the clink of cups and whispers in tiled halls. The night quiets behind you. The empire, grand and bustling only hours ago, now rests under a soft velvet sky. You walk slower now. Your limbs feel heavier, pleasantly so. The ground beneath your feet no longer cobbled or dusty, just soft, maybe imagined. The scent of cardamom lingers faintly, like a dream you almost remember. There's no need to chase it. It'll come back next time. You think of the hands that brewed all those cups, apprentices and empresses, shopkeepers and storytellers, each one adding a little of themselves to the mix, each one stirring something more than coffee. Let that warmth stay with you now. Let it settle low in your chest, like that final sip before the candle goes out. You're safe here. There's nothing left to learn tonight, no more customs to memorize. Just a slow exhale and a little silence between thoughts. Even the grounds in your cup are still now. No messages left, no omens to read. So let your breath fall gently. Let your eyelids grow heavier. You've wandered through the Ottoman Empire and back, and all without leaving your blanket. If you're still awake, well, that's okay. Maybe rewind to the harem part and drift through it again. But if you're already gone, if your breathing has found its rhythm and your thoughts have curled up like cats on a windowsill, then sweet dreams.